There are pains that don't show up on tests, pains that antibiotics don't cure, that compresses can't soothe, that don't respond even to the most modern medications. Pains that live silently inside the body but scream when no one is around. And it was exactly that kind of pain that Margaret had carried for years. A pain doctors called chronic, but she called it a prison. The curious thing is that, as impossible as it seemed, relief didn't come from a new treatment. It didn't come from a doctor, nor from a medication. It came from the sound of a prayer that passed through the hospital walls and reached her soul before it reached her body. No one knows exactly when it started. What they do know is that, in that quiet wing of Providence Memorial Hospital, a simple woman, wearing a white uniform and orthopedic shoes, walked the hallways talking to herself. Or so everyone thought. But she wasn't talking to herself. She was praying. And her words weren't for her. They were for others. For the ones who were asleep, the ones intubated, the ones who had lost all hope, and even for those who never believed. She spoke to God while pushing a cleaning cart, and there, between disinfectant bottles and worn-out brooms, a secret was hidden, a forgotten psalm, one that wasn't just read, it was lived. Margaret, lying in room 214, heard that voice for the first time on a Friday afternoon. The TV was on, but the sound of that prayer cut through the volume. It was as if those words had come from another place, another time, another dimension. They didn't command the pain to leave, but they promised something deeper, a kind of relief that starts on the inside before appearing on the outside. And in that moment, even without understanding, Margaret began to cry. She didn't know who the woman in the hallway was, but she knew something was changing, and that prayer carried a power no one else had ever offered her. For days, Margaret waited again for that voice. She waited for the sound of footsteps, for the squeak of the cleaning cart's wheels, until she saw her. A regular cleaning lady, the kind no one notices. But there was something in her eyes, a strange peace, contrasting with the tired eyes of someone who's been hospitalized too long. Margaret couldn't explain it, but she was certain that woman wasn't walking alone, and that's when the story began to change. Because when the soul senses that something is about to be healed, the body begins to prepare itself. And without even realizing it, Margaret was being led to a psalm hidden in the scriptures, a psalm many avoid reading, a psalm that speaks of pain, but also of redemption, of weight, but also of liberation, of crushed bones, but of a soul that can still sing. And before we continue, I want to make you an invitation. If you know someone who's fighting an invisible pain, whether physical, emotional, or spiritual, write their name in the comments right now, or your own name. Leave a message of hope too, or a small story of faith. Let's turn this comment section into a living prayer room, where every name is like a lit candle, every word a bridge to a miracle, and every gesture a sign that it's still worth believing. And if this beginning touched your heart, leave a like as well. Not as just another click, but as an act of faith. Like someone saying, I believe God still speaks, and he can use even a whispered prayer in the hallway to change an entire life. But what that woman said still echoes in those hospital halls, because it wasn't a common prayer. It was a psalm almost no one reads. She had tried everything, except this. Margaret's medical file filled 2 volumes: fibromyalgia, chronic lower back pain, fatigue syndrome, somatized anxiety attacks, recurring insomnia, adjustment disorder. She had been told the problem was in her nerves, later that it was in her muscles. At another time, they blamed her, hormones. The truth was, after nearly a decade living with deep exhaustion and pain that moved without logic, she no longer expected a diagnosis. She just wanted to live a day without pain. She had tried it all: conventional medications, natural anti-inflammatories, acupuncture sessions, Reiki, soaking in tubs of mineral salts. Nothing worked for more than 2 or 3 days. The pain always came back, sometimes milder, sometimes crushing. And the worst part wasn't even the physical discomfort. It was the feeling that no one believed the pain was real anymore. Yuektatin looked at her with doubt. Friends suggested it was all in her head, and even family members began treating her like someone who needed more willpower than care. That hospital visit had come after an especially intense flare-up. The pain radiated from her back to her shoulders and down into her arms. Painkillers felt like water. Physical therapy had no effect. All test results were normal again. And once more, the neurologist suggested the problem might not be physical. Margaret listened in silence, didn't argue. She had learned that explaining her pain was useless. She had stopped trying to be understood. All she wanted was rest, and maybe, just maybe, one decent night of sleep. It was in that state of total exhaustion, physical, emotional, and spiritual, that she first heard the voice in the hallway. It wasn't a loud voice, not dramatic. It was more like a whisper. But there was something about it that seemed to pass through walls, a warm, serene tone, like someone speaking to an old friend. Lord, I don't know each pain in this place, but you do. Pour your balm where no medicine can reach. Restore what is broken, quiet what torments, and breathe your healing into these tired bones. Margaret stopped shifting in bed. She froze, trying to listen more closely. There was something different there. It wasn't the kind of prayer meant to impress. It was an intimate, real conversation. She felt a wave of warmth in her chest. It wasn't emotion. It was as if for a brief moment, her body stopped fighting the pain, and for the first time in years, the silence inside her felt bearable. That night, Margaret fell asleep without medication, her first deep sleep in over 6 years. She woke up a few times, yes, but not because of the stabbing pain that usually made her cry in the dark. The morning came lighter. She cried again, but this time, not because of pain, but because of its absence. In the days that followed, she started paying attention to the woman's schedule. It was always after 2 p.m. She wore blue rubber gloves, pushed a cart with cleaning supplies, and walked with her eyes down. Her name tag simply read Gloria, and no one seemed to notice her. But Margaret waited for her, even if she couldn't explain why. On a Tuesday morning, she finally saw Gloria stop at her doorway. She didn't come in. She just smiled gently and said, "The psalm I'm praying is for you, but I can't tell you which one yet." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. She tried to ask more, but Gloria had already walked away. And what remained was that phrase, suspended in the air, like a password for something yet to come. And without realizing it, Margaret began to hold on to that moment, like someone waiting for a new medication, but one that comes from heaven, not the pharmacy. And that's how, without even knowing it, she began to believe again, because she had slept without pain for the first time in 6 years. And that, no one could explain. Gloria wasn't part of the medical team. She didn't wear a white coat or a stethoscope, but her uniform, always clean and neatly pressed, carried a kind of dignity few people could see. She was a 63-year-old woman, brown-skinned, with her hair tucked under a simple net, and orthopedic shoes that seemed to hum softly with each step. Many in the hospital thought she talked to herself in the hallways, but she wasn't talking to herself. She was praying, and she didn't pray for herself. She prayed for everyone, for the child crying on the pediatric floor, for the mother receiving a difficult diagnosis, for the elderly man asking God for just a little more time. She called it her heavenly shift. She said that while doctors took care of the body, she cleaned the floor and helped the spirit breathe. There was a reverence in her movements. She wasn't theatrical. She didn't preach. She simply spoke softly while working, as if talking to someone who was always listening. "Lord, you know every tear this floor has seen, so send your wind here too. Let no dust remain in these souls, Lord, not one speck." No one paid much attention to her, but the more sensitive patients, the ones who'd been there the longest, noticed something different. It was as if Gloria's presence was a silent reminder that hope still existed, even when everything around seemed cold, repetitive, and mechanical. She disrupted the routine without making noise, like a warm breeze in a sterile room. Margaret began tracking her schedule. Every afternoon, Exactly at 2:12 p.m., Gloria would pass by with her cart. She always followed the same path, starting at the far end of the hallway and finishing near the cafeteria. But it wasn't the route. That made her different. It was the atmosphere she carried. And Margaret, even without strength, began jotting down stray phrases, snippets that Gloria murmured with her head down. They sounded like pieces of psalms, but not the famous ones. Not Psalm 23, not Psalm 91. There was something deeper, rawer, more human. "Do not rebuke me in your anger," she heard one day. "My wounds are foul and festering," she heard the next afternoon. "I am bent over, greatly bowed down," she wrote on her medication sheet. Margaret started collecting those phrases like clues. She knew there was a psalm behind them, but she didn't yet know which one, and somehow that kept her going, like someone waiting for the next chapter in a story that mysteriously felt like her own. One time she tried to strike up a conversation. She asked if Gloria belonged to a church, if she was a pastor, a missionary. But the answer was simple, almost unassuming. "I'm just a woman who's cleaned floors my whole life and learned there are messes only God can clean." Margaret smiled. It was the first time in a long while she had smiled without pain, and there was something in that answer that felt truer than any sermon. On Thursday afternoon, something unexpected happened. Gloria stopped pushing her cart in the middle of the hallway. She took a deep breath, walked slowly toward the door of room 214, and stood there in silence for a few seconds. Margaret, pretending to read a book, noticed. And then she heard, "The psalm is for you, but I still can't tell you which one, because before you understand it with your eyes, you need to feel it with your bones." Margaret didn't understand, but those words echoed in her mind like a code. Bones? What did she mean? Feel it with the bones? She thought of her own pain, the stiffness in her body, the muscle fatigue, the cracking of her joints. Maybe that was it. Maybe the psalm spoke to the deepest part of being, not to the intellect, not even to emotion, but to the inner framework, the very thing that keeps us standing when everything else collapses. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. But for the first time, it wasn't because of pain. It was anticipation, restlessness, as if her body were preparing itself to receive something that was on its way, something that couldn't be bought at the pharmacy, injected into the vein, or prescribed by any doctor. It was something that came from another place, from a place where even a hospital floor could become sacred, and it was there, between the creaking of wheels and the soft voice of a woman the world had forgotten, that Margaret's soul began to be touched. And when the soul is touched, the body feels it, even if it doesn't understand yet. Margaret's improvement didn't happen overnight. It wasn't one of those cases doctors write up as sudden remission or unexplained outcome. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but real. In the first 48 hours after hearing Gloria's prayer, Margaret slept better. Not fully, but enough to feel that something was shifting. The pain in her hip no longer pulsed with the same intensity. Her shoulders felt looser, and even the stiffness in her hands, which had made it hard to hold a glass, had lessened. What was curious is that the doctors hadn't changed a thing in her treatment. The medication was the same, the diet unchanged, the exercises the same, but Margaret's body was different, as if, in some invisible way, something was beginning to align from the inside out. And even though she wanted to believe it was just coincidence, one turning point was impossible to ignore. It had all started when she heard that prayer. When that simple woman, walking by with a cleaning cart, planted words in her that she didn't fully understand, but that her body seemed to recognize. With each of Gloria's visits to the hallway, Margaret became more alert. She started listening closely, like someone trying to decode a riddle. She wanted to know which psalm it was. She needed to know. She wrote down every fragment, whispered them to herself before bed, compared them to scriptures on her phone. One day she thought it was Psalm 6, another day maybe 102, but nothing matched perfectly. It was as if Gloria were reciting verses from a psalm that didn't exist in books, but was complete in the soul. One afternoon, Margaret decided to ask directly. She waited for Gloria to walk past her room and said, "Excuse me, but what exactly have you been praying? I heard some phrases. They sound like a psalm, but I don't recognize them." Gloria smiled gently, but her response was even more mysterious. "Some psalms need to be felt before they're read, and you're still feeling. When the pain stops speaking, the psalm will start speaking to you." Margaret remained silent. It didn't make much logical sense, but something inside her understood. Pain had always been the dominant voice in her life. Pain dictated her schedule, her choices, her relationships. Pain decided if she could go out, if she could work, if she had strength to smile. Pain was a tyrant, and now, for the first time, it was weakening. And that made space for something new, something that didn't have a name yet, but might just be faith. In the days that followed, she noticed something else. Her mind felt lighter, as if the weight that had blocked her belief was gradually dissolving. It wasn't just the body that was healing, it was the soul, her gaze. The silence, which once felt suffocating, now began to sound like a peaceful place. On a sunny morning, Margaret received a visit from the hospital's social worker, someone who had known her for months. The woman was surprised by the patient's appearance. She commented, "You look different. I don't just mean your face. It's like there's some kind of light in you. Are you on a new treatment?" Margaret hesitated, then answered sincerely, "No. I just started listening to another voice." The social worker didn't understand, but Margaret did, and she decided not to force explanations on anyone else. She was too busy listening to the new questions rising inside herself. Then on a Friday, at exactly 2:07 p.m., 5 minutes earlier than usual, Gloria walked into the room. No broom, no cart, just a small Bible in her hands, closed. She looked into Margaret's eyes, stepped closer to the bed and said firmly, "Today is the day. You're going to read it with me, and your soul will understand what your body has been feeling." Margaret froze. Her heart was racing. Something deep inside her began to stir. It was as if, in that very moment, the universe had paused to hear a prayer that hadn't even been spoken yet, but was already being answered. And that's when she knew. The psalm was coming, not just to her mind, but to her bones, her story, to the place where no one had ever reached, the center of her pain. Gloria didn't speak at first. She simply sat in the chair next to Margaret's bed and rested the small Bible on her knees. She didn't open it right away. She didn't rush to the text. It was as if she were waiting for something, as if the atmosphere itself was still being prepared. And Margaret, who was once impatient by nature, realized she couldn't, and didn't want to, interrupt that moment with questions. She just watched, silent, heart pounding, body on alert, soul open. Gloria then took a deep breath. Her time-worn eyes looked down at the Bible with reverence, and for the first time she spoke. "Margaret, pain is a language, and for a long time it's been the only one you've spoken. But now it's time to learn another. And this psalm is the translation of your story." She opened the pages carefully. Her fingers knew exactly where to land. Then she read, with a voice both firm and sacred, "O Lord, do not rebuke me in your anger, or discipline me in your wrath. Your arrows have pierced me, and your hand has come down on me. Because of your wrath there is no health in my body. There is no soundness in my bones because of my sin." Psalm 38:1-3. Margaret swallowed hard. Those words were raw. They didn't speak of instant victory. They didn't promise quick deliverance. They were the verses of someone broken. And that's exactly why they felt so real. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply. The tears came before she could stop them, but it was a different kind of cry, not from pain, but from recognition. For the first time, she felt the Bible was speaking about her. Gloria continued. She read verse after verse, without rushing. With each line, Margaret felt pieces of her forgotten story being named. She remembered her neglected childhood, her disappointments in youth, the failed relationships, the forced silences, the nights she screamed inside while smiling outside. Psalm 38 was raw, yes, but it was true. It felt as though someone had written it right there in the hospital, between an injection and a blood draw. As if God himself understood that some pains live in the body, but were born in the soul. When Gloria finished reading, she closed the Bible and gently held Margaret's hand, and said only this: "Now you understand. Pain was the language, but it doesn't need to be your path anymore." Margaret didn't know what to say. She felt exhausted yet peaceful, a kind of peace she had never known before. A relief with no explanation, as if her body had finally surrendered, as if her soul had finally been heard. Gloria then prayed, a short prayer, but one that hit deep. "Lord, you know every bone that has groaned in silence. You've seen every tear that was never cried, every scream that stayed buried. Today we return this pain to your hands, not as a complaint, but as a confession. Restore what's broken, rebuild what's been lost, and teach her soul to speak the new language of hope. In Jesus' name, amen." Margaret sat in silence for several minutes. Then she took a deep breath, like someone returning from a deep place, and finally asked, her voice still trembling, "Why this psalm? Why not one of the beautiful ones, or one of the popular ones?" Gloria answered with a soft smile, "Because God heals with truth, and there's no truth more beautiful than the one that accepts its own pain in order to be transformed." They embraced, a long, silent hug where two stories met without needing words. And in that instant, Margaret knew that psalm hadn't just comforted her, it had rewired something deep inside her, as if by naming her pain, it had freed her soul. Then Gloria said, still with her hands folded, "Now you're ready to ask. Write the name of someone who needs this healing too, because the psalm that healed you may be the answer to someone else's prayer today." Margaret left the hospital 7 days after that prayer. She didn't leave healed, at least not in the clinical sense. She still felt some pain. She still needed medication now and then. But something new had been awakened inside her, and there was no medical term to describe it. Her eyes looked different. Her walk had changed. Her gestures were softer. She had a renewed willingness to look up at the sky. It was as if her body was still under treatment, but her soul had already been discharged. When she got home, the first thing she did was open the Bible to the marked page, Psalm 38. She reread it in silence and cried again. Not because of the words themselves, but because of what they still stirred within her. It was as if each verse held up a mirror, reflecting everything she had ignored, suppressed, or forgotten, and now welcomed. For the first time, Margaret felt that her pain had been heard, not by the healthcare system, not by doctors, but by something greater, by a God who understands bones, tears, and exhaustion like no one else. She began writing. She pulled out an old notebook and started copying the psalm by hand, verse by verse, pairing each line with a memory. "This was when my sister told me I was faking the pain," she wrote next to verse 5. "This was the day I gave up looking for a diagnosis," she added after verse 8. And so, page by page, Margaret built a journal of healing. A private memorial between her and God. Without even realizing, she had formed a new habit. Every morning before coffee, she read the psalm out loud, not as a duty, but as a ritual of liberation. And something curious began to happen. The morning pain, the one that once made it nearly impossible to get out of bed, began to fade. Her movements were lighter, her breathing smoother, her energy returning. It was as if her body were being retrained by the words her soul had finally accepted. One day, she did something unexpected. She wrote Psalm 38 by hand on fine paper, folded it neatly, and placed it in a white envelope. On the front, she wrote only, This prayer healed me on the inside. Maybe it will heal you too. She went to the hospital and asked to leave the envelope with the front desk, without a name. She only said that, if a patient was having a difficult day, that paper could be given as an anonymous gift. 2 weeks later, she received a call from the hospital's social worker. A patient battling deep depression had found the envelope on her breakfast tray. And when she read the psalm, something happened. It wasn't an instant cure, but it was a shift, a spark. She had asked to speak with whoever had written it, to say thank you. Margaret declined. She only said, "The author of that psalm is pain. I was just the translator." The next week, Margaret wrote 2 more letters, then 4, then 12. She began visiting the hospital chapel as a volunteer, just to pray quietly during visiting hours. One day, she saw a young man with swollen eyes sitting alone. She left a letter beside him and walked away in silence. Later, she heard he had prayed for the first time in years, and slowly, a pattern began to form. Whoever received the psalm was touched, not by the words on the page, but by the spirit behind them. That's when Margaret understood. The psalm had been given to her not to keep, but to share. Like bread, like medicine, like prayer. And the more she shared it, the more her own healing advanced. One day, after reading the psalm aloud in the chapel, Margaret looked up at the ceiling and said, "I'll never again ask for the pain to go away by force, but now I know. It no longer owns me." The peace that filled her body in that moment had no logical explanation. It was as if something invisible had settled on her shoulders, replacing the old weight. It was light. It was alive. It was faith. And it all started with a forgotten psalm, read by an invisible woman, heard by a tired soul. A soul that, once it stopped resisting, finally learned how to be healed. Margaret returned to the hospital a few weeks later, not as a patient but as someone carrying a mission. The first thing she did was walk down the hallway where she used to hear Gloria's prayers. The floor was the same, the walls unchanged, but something had shifted inside her. She now knew what so many still didn't. Not all healing comes from medicine. Sometimes it comes from the silence between one prayer and another, from the space where God whispers what no one else hears. At the front desk, she left more envelopes, each one containing a handwritten copy of Psalm 38. No signature, no request for thanks. Just the same phrase on the front. If your pain has a name, this psalm has an answer. As she walked toward the chapel, she saw a young woman sitting, alone, quietly crying. It was the kind of scene that used to stir pity, but now, it stirred purpose. Margaret sat beside her, gently took her hand and said, "I don't know what your pain is, but I've been on the other side, and I can pray with you, if you'd like." The girl nodded, unable to speak, and Margaret began to pray, softly. Without theatrical force, without urgency, just faith, lived faith, felt faith, faith that had been born when everything else had failed, and that's why now, I want to pray with you too. If you've followed this story up to this point, maybe you know someone like Margaret, someone tired of trying, someone fighting a pain that no medicine can reach. Maybe that someone is you. And if it is, place your hand over your chest now. Close your eyes for a moment and pray with me. Lord, I don't know how this pain began, but you do. And if it's still here, maybe it's because my soul still needs to learn how to speak what my body has already screamed. Today, I return this pain to your hands, not as a complaint, but as surrender. Use this pain if you will. Heal it if it's your will. But above all, show me that I am not this pain. Show me there's still life beyond it. Amen. And if you know someone who's suffering, a father, a mother, a friend, a child, or even a stranger, write their name in the comments right now, or write your own, and leave a message of hope, a verse, a testimony. Let's turn this space into a digital sanctuary, where every comment is an altar, every name a lit candle, every prayer a bridge between heaven and someone's pain. And if this story touched your heart, click the like button now. Not as just another viewer, but as someone stepping into an invisible chain. A chain of faith that starts right here and might reach into the hospital rooms where no one else can go. Because healing often begins when we pray for someone who doesn't even know they're being remembered.